We are continuing our study in the Gospel of John. In John chapter 18, verses 1 through 1942, we see the trial and the passion, the suffering of Jesus. But in John 18, 1 through 12, we see the Lord Jesus surrenders. But this video is just 18, 1 through 3. And in these three verses, we read about how both the Lord Jesus and his enemies got into place for these important events. One might say that these verses put everyone in place for the betrayal and arrest. And certainly those two things do happen. But the text also clearly describes the events of chapter 18, verses 1 through 12, as the Lord's surrender to the Jews and Gentiles. And we'll see more about that. John emphasizes the power of the Lord Jesus as he describes his arrest, or rather his surrender. He has recorded the prayer in the upper room, chapter 17, but nothing about the seemingly weak prayer in Gethsemane. In fact, John doesn't even mention the name Gethsemane at all. John alone records how they fell backwards at the I am, the ego eimi of verse 5. And yet John does not mention the healing of Malchus' ear. So let's look at these verses. Chapter 18, verse 1. Having said these things, Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron winter torrent where there was a garden, into which he went, he and his disciples. As we talked about in the video on chapter 14, verse 31, it is not clear whether they had already departed the upper room by the time Jesus' words in 14:31 were pronounced, or whether their departure was postponed actually until this verse. If their departure was delayed, then this verse says that they went out of the upper room, then headed for the Kidron. If they did depart from the upper room in 14:31, then this verse tells of another going out, which is not explained. Perhaps from the upper room they went into the temple, because the gates to the temple remained open even on the night after the Passover celebration. People were free to enter the grounds of the temple. So this verse could tell of the departure of the Lord from the court of the temple. It is also possible that this verse refers to them coming out of the walled city of Jerusalem. In other words, it says, having said these things, Jesus went out with his disciples. But what did they go out of? Well, it's really not quite clear. But they went out across the Kidron winter torrent where there was a garden, into which he went, he and his disciples. The ancient city of Jerusalem was not at all large by modern standards because the defensive walls around a city were expensive to build. Cities tended to be small and crowded. Their walk may have taken half an hour if they came from the upper room, and it would be much less if they came out of the temple. The elevation of the Temple Mount was 730 meters above sea level. The top of the Mount of Olives was 60 meters higher than that. The bottom of the Kidron Valley at that point was 670 meters. And it was less than 1 kilometer straight across from the Temple Mount to the top of the Mount of Olives, as the crow flies in a straight line. So we know that they descended about 60 vertical meters down to the Kidron Valley, but we do not know how far up the slopes of the Mount of Olives they went. In this photo, you can see the view from near the top of the Mount of Olives towards Jerusalem. The word translated winter torrent here is kamaros. It actually refers to seasonal rivers or streams that only have water during the rainy season. In English, the Arabic word wadi and the Spanish word arroyo can be used to describe these seasonal streams. During the dry time of year, they're just a wash, rocks and sand, but no water. And during the rainy season, there's water flowing down. Even now, the Kidron winter torrent only has a stream flowing down it in the winter because that's when most of the rain falls. These events took place in early April, it was Passover, when the rainy season is usually ending. In the photo, you can see the view from near the Kidron winter torrent up to the Temple Mount. The wall that you can see at the very top was built under the direction of Suleiman I during the 16th century, many centuries after these events. This garden is, of course, Gethsemane. Its name strongly suggests that it was an olive grove. John doesn't mention this name, but the name of the place is referred to as Gethsemane in Matthew 26:36, and also Mark 14:32. Gethsemane, or maybe, depending on your manuscript, Gethsemane, is a Greek transliteration meaning oil press. The word we translate as garden is kapos, and it can mean garden or vineyard. So because of the name Gethsemane, it is assumed that this place was a grove of olive trees. There are actually several sites on the western slope of the Mount of Olives that claim to be this Gethsemane. In the photo, you can see some very old olive trees in the traditional site of Gethsemane. That garden that the Lord and his disciples went into seems to have been a walled garden, because in verse 1 they go into it, and in verse 4 the Lord Jesus comes out of it. Chapter 18, verse 2. But also Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus often gathered there with his disciples. They often gathered there when they were in Jerusalem, but those visits to this specific place are not recorded in any of the four Gospels specifically. That they often gathered there is confirmed by the words, as was his custom, as Luke describes this event in Luke 22:39. It says, and going out he went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him, as was his custom. Now, Carson explains that according to the Jewish custom, they were required to remain near the city of Jerusalem on Passover night. This place, we know the name is Gethsemane, was quite close to the walled city. Bethany, where they usually spent the night, must have been outside the limits permitted by Jewish custom. It seems that Judas and the Jewish leaders chose that time and that place because it would seem to suggest they could have a smooth and safe betrayal and arrest. The setting was quiet, away from the crowds that might violently object to the popular rabbi and miracle worker being arrested. Chapter 18, verse 3. Therefore Judas, taking a detachment, and some servants of the chief priests and of the Pharisees, comes there with torches and lamps and weapons. The term used here about the detachment of soldiers is spera. It can actually refer to 1,000 soldiers, but that is unlikely here because that would be all of the soldiers that were stationed in Jerusalem at that time. It can also mean 200 soldiers, but even that is unlikely. It was a detachment from the main body of soldiers that were there in Jerusalem because of the feast. Note, though, that Michaels accepts the unlikely idea that there were 600 men there. That's kind of hard to imagine. Those soldiers would stay at the Antonio Fortress, which was just outside the northwest corner of the temple courtyards and wall. Today, there's a nunnery built on top of the old site, and in the basement of that nunnery, you can still see the stone floor of the ancient fortress, with games scratched onto its surface probably by Roman soldiers. Usually the Roman troops who were not on duty at the time were stationed in Caesarea, but they would be assigned to Jerusalem during the holidays because the city was always full, always busy, and there was always the possibility of a riot or an attempted revolt against Roman rule. The servants mentioned in this verse are also mentioned in chapter 7, verse 32. In this way, Jews and Gentiles are represented in the arrest of the Son of God. And by the way, this is the last mention of the Pharisees in John's Gospel. We read here about the chief priests. This word, archierus, can refer to the high priest, but here in the plural, it must refer to the chief priests. The chief priests, these people controlled the Sanhedrin, the Sunedrion, and they controlled the temple. They were a part of the upper class, unlike the Pharisees. The chief priests were Sadducees, a group which is not mentioned by name in the Gospel of John. Although they were enemies, the chief priests, Sadducees, and the Pharisees are mentioned together in 732, 745, 1147, and 1157. They were willing to put aside their differences to oppose the Lord Jesus. In the Jewish calendar, which is lunar, the Passover always falls on a full moon. They may have brought along these torches and lamps because it was a cloudy night, but it does seem ironic in the Gospel of John that we read they brought torches and lamps to hunt down the one that we know is the light of the world. They may have mistakenly thought that they were going to have to search out for someone hiding among the olive groves on the Mount of Olives. Well, by way of summary, in these 3 verses, we read how both the Lord Jesus and his enemies got into their proper place for the surrender, the betrayal, and the arrest of the Lord Jesus.